Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Leading the Shift. I'm your host, Susan Etlinger. If you're new here, this is a podcast from Microsoft Azure where we hear from people at the forefront of data, AI, and cloud technologies. There's a meme going around the socials about Gen X. If you want to know why we're mad, it's because we had to replace our record collections with tape, and then CD, and then MP3, and now we need a subscription to listen to music. And it's kind of a perfect example of why we need to look at technology change from multiple angles. Look, I still regret selling my vinyl collection, but not at the expense of artists and creators who would never have had the funds or access to make and distribute their music, and what's more, create entirely new genres. Today, my guest is Robby Ingebretsen, founder and creative director of Pixel Lab, an award-winning design and development studio based in Seattle. We're going to talk about a project really close to his heart, a fan remix experience that builds on the release of Coldplay's new album, Moon Music, and its film compendium, A Film for the Future. Before we dive in, let's listen to a clip where Sam Seeger, head of visual content for Coldplay, Ben Moore, executive producer of A Film for the Future, and Robby tell us a little bit more about the project.
I'm really sorry for some things I said along the way.
A Film for the Future is a very ambitious idea that Team Coldplay came up with.
It's a semi-curated approach. There's about 100 or more amazing content creators, directors, animators who've worked on it. When you move into the microsite remix phase of the project, we're looking at AI technology, including Copilot.
So we're using Azure Video Analyzer, and we run all these clips through that, and literally within minutes, we're getting like a huge amount of information about what content is contained in each of those clips, information about like color, motion.
The fans are actually getting to create like a living time capsule, I call it.
Not only have fans submitted content, which will be part of the remix experience, but fans are able to kind of in real time engage with the piece of content that they created with that remix. Anyone could visit this site and be able to interact with that amazing collection of visuals.
Robby, welcome to Leading the Shift.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have this conversation. The premise for this whole podcast and the reason it's called Leading the Shift is that, in our lifetimes, we've seen so much technology change, from the PC to the internet, mobile, all that stuff. But the music industry has had its own series of platform shifts as well. And it kind of reminds me of a story from my own childhood. And I know that you and I have this in common, although from different perspectives. That, when I was a kid, my parents worked in the music industry. And around that time, Stevie Wonder was working on Music of My Mind, and my dad worked for Motown. And I remember these conversations as a little kid, like hearing about how musicians were so, they're just intrigued by the synthesizer, but also I think a little scared of what the new technology might bring. And, he was really I think just a kind of a pioneer in terms of taking a new technology and using it to sort of not only deepen his own creative expression, but actually create much more mixable and kind of engaging experiences for his audience. So anyway, it just reminds me of that as I was doing the deep dive into your background. Your dad was a pioneer in the development of digital sound, as I understand it, right?
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, we have apocryphal stories in our family of him actually interacting with Stevie Wonder. So my dad helped start a company called Soundstream. He had worked with a guy named Tom Stockham when he was in college. Tom Stockham had helped him with his master's thesis. And together they created this company called Soundstream, which was, as far as I know, the first company with a commercial digital audio recorder. And, they, as you can imagine, had a big task in front of them trying to convince this industry that in some ways legitimately and in some ways not legitimately had a lot of concerns about adopting a new technology. I mean, there were some legitimate concerns, I think, that it was expensive and new and hard to use. There was a learning curve, but there was also just a lot of emotion, I think, with people being afraid of something new just because it was new and unfamiliar. But he started this company, and then they had a big task of convincing people to use it. And there's stories in my family of, the various important people that he talked to, including like Frank Zappa and Fleetwood Mac. They actually did some mixing work on Tusk. But one of the highlights was talking to Stevie Wonder. And my dad used to tell me, just how incredibly open he seemed to everything new. And that was, I think, a real highlight for him, actually, was talking to Stevie.
No, that's amazing. I mean, I love that story because, he took something new and he made something even just, that had never been seen before. And it feels like we're at that moment now with, with artificial intelligence and data. And of course, the history of technology is a history of people adapting and changing and learning and figuring out what the new world looks like. And of course, a lot of the things that happened in the 70s feel like they're the basis for all the mixing and remixing experiences that, the people have every day. So I just think it's really cool that the two of us sort of have that same kind of heritage. So let's talk a little bit about you and about your work at Pixel Lab. Tell us a little bit about the organization, what you do, the kinds of projects you take on.
Yeah, so Pixel Lab we're a digital agency primarily focused on web development work. We have done a bunch of activations with Microsoft and then with Microsoft partners. And I think we've developed a bit of a reputation for a willingness to adopt newer technologies and sort of push the envelope with what you can do with them. And so a lot of times when Microsoft has something new or something exciting that they're trying to explore or prove out, they've come to us to try to find ways to use it in an interesting or creative way. So and I guess we've been doing that with Microsoft for over a decade now, for a long time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that definitely predates me.
Yeah.
So I know that you have been working on a project that's super exciting with a band, and you can finally talk about who that band is and what the project is. So would you let us know a little bit about that?
That's funny, actually. We had to keep this under wraps for quite a while because of which band it was. So the project is with Coldplay, and it's a really cool project. So actually, even independent of the piece that we're doing, it's a really cool project. Coldplay had this idea that for the album, they would reach out to, I think it is literally hundreds of both, larger and well-known, but also a lot of independent video artists, and ask them to essentially create a video interpretation of some section of the album. And what was really cool about it is each artist had a section, but they didn't know what came before or after. And then there was a single producer whose job was to take all of those, I guess, first of all, to write a creative brief that he gave to each of those video producers, and then stitch them all together into sort of this film that sort of represents, I guess, hundreds of interpretations of this album. The film itself is really, really cool. We had a chance to see it both in an early form as well as, I don't think I've seen the entire finished product yet, but a bunch of it. And it's kind of amazing, honestly. It turned out great. But the creative team at Coldplay had this other idea, which is, what if we allowed individual fans to take bits of this footage and provide input in a way that they could then remix it into a video that sort of represented a sense of who they are, their own mood, of kind of what their feelings were. And so we were tasked with helping them do that. Obviously, not every fan is equipped with the skill set that you need in order to mix a whole bunch of footage into a video, especially one that is representative of your mood or your feelings or sort of your creative idea of what that song means to you. And so we use the interpretive capabilities of AI to analyze a bunch of video footage and then take input from a user and sort of marry those two things together into a mini clip, like a short film that represents what that user felt or their interpretation of the song. And it's really cool. The result is that we sort of remixed and a whole bunch of this footage that we got from these different video artists into really unique and individualized interpretations of the song. And we used the Azure AI capabilities in order to facilitate that and do that. And it turned out great. It's really cool.
That is so cool. It's funny, as you were talking, especially about the part where, maybe each creator only gets a certain clip and they don't know what came before and they don't know what came after. So, weird little background on me too is that I studied poetry in college because, of course, that's what you need to do to get into technology. But it actually but the surrealists in art, and so the surrealists had this idea back in the 20s in France called the exquisite corpse, and the game exquisite corpse was where you actually create a drawing, and then you cover your drawing and you hand it to somebody, and all they can see is the sort of connection between that drawing and what you're going to create. So the little API, right? So then they have to create their own drawing, and then you cover that one up, and then the next person. And so by doing that, you have this collaborative project that's stitched together. And so in some way, what Coldplay is doing and what you're doing with this project is very similar to this sort of art form that has existed for now 100 years, which is wild.
Yeah, that's crazy. We used to play that on road trips with my siblings, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And you get something, every time you get something really interesting, and it feels like this mashup of, the people sitting next to you's ideas. And it is really fun. That's a great analogy.
And so now we're doing that with AI. And, it's cool because we're so familiar with this idea of remixing music. It's just so much in our vocabulary now. And I think there's this opportunity or this, there's also sort of a lot of creators out there who are remixing film. And so, you see stuff like, supercuts and things like that where people they'll like dub, a film in some funny way, or they'll do the bad lip reading things and things like that. But there really is this opportunity, I think, to think about film and music together as this sort of infinitely malleable asset I think it's super exciting. And so the cool thing about it to me as well is that it brings in the fans in a way that, they haven't had that access before. And so I'm curious, like how you've thought about that, how Coldplay's thought about that, and sort of where they think that might, what they've learned, I guess, in the process.
I think that this project has given us a window into, I think, one of the many ways that people might use AI to sort of express themselves creatively. It's sort of interesting because the way I think about it is a lot of people have really, really creative ideas, but the expression of those creative ideas a lot of times requires either a lot of hours and a lot of production knowledge and a lot of ability. And sometimes that can get in the way of your ability to be expressive. In fact, as there are a lot of artists, as they evolve. Like we were at the Chihuly Museum, the glass museum in Seattle, not too long ago.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to do because you realize pretty quickly that Chihuly is setting a vision, but then he has a very large production staff that is producing a lot of the glass. It does not make it any less something that belongs to him. It's his vision. But it also, I think, picks up little bits of, like these people that are learning with him or that are producing with him. I, in a way, think of what we did with, what we did with this project with Coldplay is we were able to allow people to sort of have a production staff so they could express themselves in a creative way, but they didn't necessarily need the skill set in order to edit video or to select through hundreds of videos based on what might feel like, would be an expression of who they are. Instead, they guided an AI to select videos for them, to analyze videos for them. But in the end, it's very much an expression of ideas that were created or sort of signaled by them. And I think that this really is, in many ways, the future of how AI is going to empower people to be even more creative and even more expressive.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because I feel like there are sort of two aspects to that. One is people, for example, in the Chihuly example, that tradition of apprenticeship, where there's a visionary artist. I mean, that's been going on for hundreds of years, right? Where maybe somebody is doing the drafting or somebody, early on, or somebody is doing the printing of the famous photographer's photograph. And through that process, they're learning the techniques and the technology of that particular medium. And it feels like there's this sort of, that gives people opportunity to participate in an art form without necessarily having the skill, all the skills and all the expensive equipment and production facility and everything else. But it also, so that's really cool. But at the same time, the democratization of it also just makes that participation so much less gives it so much less friction, right? So I think that's super cool. And I think maybe, of course it's early days, right? Because this hasn't quite launched yet, but it would be super interesting to think about, like, down the line, once everything is in, what did you learn? What did Coldplay learn from the process of opening up their art and their work to a broader fan base?
Yeah, it says a lot about Coldplay, actually, that they're willing to do that, I think, as well as their ability to gather all of these video production artists. I think they've garnered, obviously, a lot of respect and love in this industry, to where people know that they can turn over something they've produced, and Coldplay will treat it with respect. But also, I think it's really great the way Coldplay, and I think we've seen this a lot, wants to involve their fans in their art. And this is a really neat example of that, I think, where they are asking people to collaborate with them on something that is, needs to be loved and respected. And I think that trusting their fans to do that in a way that, will be respected, I think shows a lot of the trust that they have in those fans.
So let's talk a little bit about the process that you went through. Were there any challenges? Like, how did you kind of navigate the whole process of doing something that sounds like it was maybe a first of its kind for Pixel Labs?
We have done a couple of projects that were sort of in the same vein. So we did a project with Lil Sims not too long ago, where you could provide inputs to produce what would essentially become a background for a video. And I think that was a little bit simpler. And I think actually was one of the reasons that we ended up doing this project with Coldplay. I think they had seen it because one of the songs on this album actually is with Lil Sims. And one of the challenges with something like this is trying to map the content, so in this case, the video assets, to something that the user, the person who wants to be expressive creatively, that they can express. And so in this case, we went through a couple of ideas. We ended up with this idea of what we've been calling a mood ring. It's sort of in line with the rainbow that is sort of a theme in some of the visual aspects of this album. So we kind of had this idea that we could take each color in the rainbow and sort of map that to an emotional characteristic or a mood. And then we would analyze each of the videos based on that mood. And then as the user kind of expressed their relationship with, some particular mood, we would use that to then select videos that seem to be the correct videos to match that, if that makes sense. So this idea of a mood ring.
Yeah. It reminds me of that there's like a neurological condition called synesthesia, where you see colors as feelings, or you experience music as colors, or different things like that. So I don't know, it feels like there's maybe some neuroscience basis, maybe some neuroscientist can weigh in.
Yeah, it is kind of exactly that, actually. That's really great. So yeah, a person with synesthesia actually may be doing this by themselves, sort of mapping a mood to a color. I also kind of think we all kind of have a sense of that too. The color yellow feels sort of hopeful, the color blue kind of feels sad. So the next step was to allow people on the site to tell us which moods sort of matched their moment, the moment that they were in. And so we do that by allowing them to select clips that they relate to answer prompts. So I think we have a prompt where they can complete a sentence. Then we take all of that input, and from that we develop this sort of mood or emotional profile. That is the thing we were calling the mood ring. Then we select videos that sort of match that, and from that we produce their sort of unique clip and contribution to this ever-playing video.
Wow. That's tremendous. And I recall that we talked about the fact that Coldplay was really not concerned, but just wanted to make sure that the way that you approach this project was as sustainable as possible. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, to their credit, Coldplay is aware of the fact that some aspects of artificial intelligence use a lot of energy. And there is some, I think, legitimate criticism and also some work going on to address that. one of the things that we realized we could do to be aware of that and I guess address that concern is do as much of the AI work up front and then use the results of the AI work on an ongoing basis. So we did a whole bunch of analysis early on of the videos, and then we cached the results of that so that we didn't have to run it every single time. So I guess the primary way that we used AI in this project was to do that analysis of the video. So we would submit these clips to Azure. Azure would come back and give us sort of an emotional profile of the video, as well as some information about movement in the video and things like that. We cached all of that information, scored it according to this mood ring, and then we could real time match that to input from the users to produce the clip. But the result of that is that we got all of the advantages of AI and Azure's AI services, but only had to use them up front for the analysis, not every single time somebody produces a clip.
So I love that as a kind of rigor, right? This idea that you start with the intention that you're going to do things as efficiently as possible. And, we're all, obviously everybody is at the beginning of this AI journey. And I think it's a really nice example of just working with a client or working with a customer through, what is the most efficient way? What is the most, what provides the least footprint on the earth to get this, to get this objective met. So Robby, how are people going to be able to see the results of this project?
So the project is called A Film for the Future, and you can see the curated version of this film on YouTube. But then if you want to participate in it and produce your own clip, you would go to afftf.coldplay.com. So that's the initials for afilmforthefuture.coldplay.com. And on that site, the first thing that you'll be able to do is watch this version of the film that is just playing indefinitely. It truly is a film for the future in that sense. And everybody who goes to the site sees the exact same version of the site at any given moment because it is built out of user submissions and they're all coordinated so you see them all at the same time. Then if you want to create your own contribution to that process, you can do that on that site as well.
That's so neat. That's so neat. So as you think about, so now that you've, kind of wrapped this project, is there anything you've learned from the past year that you think would be something that you want to do in the future? Like what changed your perspective or sort of how has this inspired you?
Oh, that's a really great question. Let me think about that. One thing that I think is kind of an interesting parallel. So I'm mostly a developer by trade. I end up with a bit of a creative director role in our team as well, but as a developer, I see enormous possibilities for AI. It's kind of interesting because if you are maybe not a creative person, I think there's sort of this reputation that, and it's true, that software development is very technical, but it's also really creative. Mm. And I think that a lot of what we've talked about in terms of how AI is empowering creative people, it's also empowering the creative aspects of writing code, where it gives you the ability to very quickly think about different approaches, be prompted toward different ways of looking at something. I've used AI in my software development practice, not just as a way to, sort of solve a small problem or to, get code that does a particular thing, but as a way to think about big problems and to sort of describe larger things or approaches that I want to take and get what would maybe normally require me to talk to a big group of people to do that kind of brainstorming. I guess also maybe that's unique to me. I really I joke a lot that I haven't really had a thought until I'm able to say it, if that makes sense. And so a lot of times I'll lean on my colleagues or other people that we work with to kind of think through a process. But more and more I've been able to do that directly with AI. Mm. And I found that to be really empowering. And in a way, that's a lot like what we're talking about, where it's almost like I have this production team that's sort of helping me. I'm bouncing ideas off. A lot of times the output of that is just a plan or a thoughtful process about how to approach something. But a lot of times, output of that is actually code for me as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, I do think of software development. I mean, I'm not a developer myself, but I think about software development absolutely as a creative discipline, as a making discipline. And I think, one of the things that I find fascinating about AI is the way that some of these themes extend from music to art to manufacturing, automation to retail to financial services, and to social impact as well. I mean, you see a lot of, in the conversations I've been having with people lately, co-creation is a huge theme, right? And impact from the person at the bottom or at the, doing the work all the way through to the implications for that particular domain or discipline or even industry. And the ability to kind of see a way forward is also really interesting to me. So yeah, I mean, I think that right now we're just still in that sort of storming phase of AI. I mean, obviously a lot of people are building things as you have and as others are building that are already delivering value, but there's still so much opportunity space. And so that brings me kind of to my last question for you is, if you were to think about other people in your similar position who are on the cusp of building something or thinking about envisioning something to build, do you have any advice, based on what you've learned and kind of based on what you've seen in the industry so far?
Oh, wow. I guess the advice would be that you don't need to be intimidated by it. One of the amazing things about these AI APIs as they've been exposed right now is that they are intuitive to use, much like the interface for something like ChatGPT or Copilot is intuitive to use. You literally provide, in many cases, text input and then get back text results. The advantage of using something like an API, of course, is that you can provide additional inputs and refinements, and so you have a lot more control over the kind of output that you get. But the APIs are not intimidating; they're really easy to use, and and I think my best advice would be jump in and try it, because it really is pretty easy and really fun. It really is as a developer, it's a really exciting place to just sort of try something out. I think a lot of times when new technologies come along, they are legitimately hard because they haven't gone through the refinement process that eventually happens. That has not been our experience so far. It's easy to just get in and really, really fun.
Yeah, it's a whole different way to interact with technology, and all of our senses are now activated, right?
Yeah.
And so there's still a lot to learn. Well, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate hearing about the project, hearing about you. It's been really fun to do a deep dive into the family history. Very belated congratulations to your father for the Academy Award recognition. And just thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, that was great. Really, really fun to talk to you. Thank you so much.
I loved this conversation so much for so many reasons. Artists have been remixing music for decades, dating back to at least the 60s and 70s. And I'm no expert, but I bet there are musicologists out there who would give us even earlier examples. The creative impulse to remix goes back even further in visual arts and literature. But what distinguishes this project and the moment we're in now is that digitalization is giving so many more creators and fans the opportunity to step into their own creative process. From a tech and business perspective, that's what we would call innovation at scale. So think about it. How can you consistently deliver more self-service and empowerment capability to your customers, consumers, developers, and other stakeholders? This is as relevant for manufacturing, automation, and financial services as it is for music and art. And I really appreciate the focus on using Gen AI efficiently, in this case, by doing as much of the video analysis upfront as possible. And it's not just the specific technique, but the joint commitment to thinking through ways to use these powerful technologies in the most sustainable way they can. And a last thought about technology shifts. Everything is so much clearer in hindsight. Things that were unthinkable even 2 years ago are table stakes now. And I loved Robby's point about how he's using Gen AI as a developer to think through and work through big problems and how fun that is for him. That's great insight for developers and really for all of us. Thanks for listening. Please keep the comments coming and stay tuned for more episodes dropping soon. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. And as I'm sure you know, new podcasts live and die on engagement. So please like, comment, share, tell your friends, and let us know what you'd like to hear about. We're listening. If you'd like to learn more about how people and organizations are innovating with Microsoft Azure, visit azure.microsoft.com.